Welcome. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development here at the Clements Library, and we're excited to have you joining us today for Cartography in the European Enlightenment, How to Build a Reference Work in 3 Easy Conversations. And this is session 1, The Building Blocks for Creating an Encyclopedia. Just a note that today's meeting is being recorded to share online, and then tomorrow we will send you a link to that recording as well as resources mentioned during today's broadcast. Just a quick tutorial in case you haven't joined the Clements Library on a Zoom presentation before. We very much encourage you to participate in the chat. It's the way that we can keep the conversation going. If you would be so kind, please select all panelists and attendees because that allows everyone to see your comments. You'll see though that the conversation goes by quickly. So if you have questions for Matthew and Mary, please put those in the Q&A section. There you can also see the questions that other participants have. And if you give it a thumbs up, that will move it to the top of the queue and that will give us some idea of what questions people would most like answered. And if you, I know we have some others who have some great knowledge. If you have a comment or maybe an additional related question, you can comment on those questions as well. And it keeps it all together. We will be putting things in side-by-side mode. If you would like to view it that way, you can do so and adjust your screen. Whoops, sorry. You can select speaker view versus gallery view. And so I can only control so much of what you see. So please take a moment to adjust so that it works best for you. In addition, we do have, as part of our DE&I initiative, the auto transcription turned on. You can adjust that by clicking the closed captioning button and turn it off or change its size as you need. Okay, great. My colleagues Anne and Tracy are also available in the chat to post some links, and they'll be monitoring if you have questions as well. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. All right, last chance to click your answer for the poll question. And I will end the polling and share the results. And as we were discussing, as people were signing in, many of us know that we've used an encyclopedia, a printed copy, but it's long enough ago that we're not sure exactly when. But I do see that some people have been consulting paper copies more recently. So it's alive and well. All right, and now it's my great pleasure to introduce Mary Pedley. Mary is the Assistant Curator of Maps at the Clements Library and co-editor with Matthew Edney of The History of Cartography, Volume 4, Cartography in the European Enlightenment. Her research has focused on the French and English map makers and map production in the long 18th century. She's been associated with the Clements Library since 1984. Her undergraduate degree is in classical studies, Greek and Latin, and her PhD is in geography from the University of London. So we're thrilled to have you take the reins and introduce Matthew and tell us more about maps, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you everybody for being here this afternoon on what in Ann Arbor is a very beautiful afternoon, almost a shame to be inside, but glad you're here to join us. I am pleased that Angela is using this picture of my good friend and colleague Matthew and me with the manuscript of volume 4 of the history of cartography just before it was sent off to the University of Chicago Press. And that pile of papers, believe it or not, is in fact an encyclopedia before it's printed. And Matthew and I have worked together on that pile of papers for almost 20 years. We were first invited by David Woodward of the History of Cartography Project to help out with volume 4. And I'm going to turn over to Matthew, who's in Maine, joining us this afternoon to introduce himself a little bit and some of his interests and why it was that he became involved with David Woodward in working on the History of Cartography project. So Matthew.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone. So I'm Matthew Edney, and since David died, I've been the director of the History of Cartography project. But actually, I began with the project in my first 2 years in grad school. David recruited me. Well, actually, Brian recruited me, but under an NEH grant to be the illustrations editor for volume 1. So my first 2 years of grad school were not too far from where that picture was taken, figuring out the images of volume 1. Anyway, my own interests are varied, but I've been interested in the 18th century and the 19th century for a very long time. So it was a great pleasure when David asked me to be one of the editors of volume 4. The idea being that volumes 1 through 3 are taking so long. And Mary, why don't you start your, if we end the sharing and Mary starts, so that way we can go on to the
I will.
The second image.
Right. I think it's time that, are we there? Can we, I'll move this into that mode.
Maybe advance the next one.
And here's the series of the history of cartography.
Yes. And I should say Mary is running the PowerPoint because for whatever reason, her PowerPoint on the PC has more functions that she likes to use than I have on my Mac. So anyway, so David and Brian Harley had begun the History of Cartography project as a 4-volume series, which for various reasons we don't have time to go into today, rapidly grew into 6. And then volume 2 grew into 3 separate parts, and you can see them all laid out here. But volumes 1 through 3 took a very long time. And so David, in very late 90s, early 2000s, was interested in trying to figure out how to have more than one volume in preparation at the same time as a way to try to speed up the whole, which has sort of worked. The last 3 volumes are coming out at a faster clip. May not feel that way, but they are. And so Mary and I were invited for our respective interests, me on sort of the surveying and the geographical side of things, and Mary on the trade and the printing side of things. And so we sort of put them all together. I should say that initially Graham Burnett was also working with us until the pressures of trying to get tenure at Princeton meant that he could not continue as editor, so he stepped down. Can't remember when that was now. Anyway, So we have done volume 4, which covers European Enlightenment, which is roughly 1650, give or take, to about 1800, give or take, depending on the topic. We go back and forth.
And I'll just say here that you might be wondering in the audience why there was a need for a series of volumes about the history of cartography. And it really was because nothing existed that offered a reference work for anybody to learn anything about this human endeavor that has been around since prehistoric times. So the larger idea of Brian Harley and David Woodward was to create something that people like all of us could turn to find out more. And these volumes came out as a chronological series, as you can see, and they're dedicated to really rethinking the history of maps and map making from 2 perspectives or contexts, so that there's a consistency across all 6 of these volumes. And these 2 perspectives or contexts we'll talk about now. And I should say at this point that all the images we're using in this presentation all come from volume 4, come from the 18th century volume. And in every image, you will see a figure number and the title of the article that figure illustrates, the name of the author of the article, and then a short caption of the illustration itself. So Matthew, maybe you want to take us through maps as social instruments.
Surely. So the first way in which David and Brian sort of started to rethink what should be included in the field of map history is to understand that maps are social instruments. They're made by humans to be used by humans in all sorts of different ways. And so here we see Louis XIV, King of France, the Sun King, proudly showing off to his ministers his knowledge of the various fortified towns that the French had recently conquered along the Rhine. And so here he is sort of in front of this, I mean, this is on a ceiling in Versailles, the great palace of Versailles. And so he's pointing out in front of his imaginary army camp, he himself didn't go into the field, all the towns upon which the French had recently conquered. But he's pointing at the kind of manuscript maps made by hand, that were the mainstay of military mapping through the early modern periods, right up into the 19th century. They were made by engineers and they circulated in small numbers. Many were just for fortifications and the areas around fortifications. They might reach into the collections of a royal administrator. Later in the 18th century, George III assembled a huge collection of maps, now in the British Library, basically by the fact he stole them. Anybody who gave him a map, well, they've lost it, is in his personal collection now, which is why there's this wonderful, massive collection, rather than having it frittered away. They were not, these kinds of maps were limited in circulation. They're manuscript, they're maybe 3 or 4 copies of each, maybe some very drafty copies, maybe some very polished, refined for giving to people like the king. But at the same time, a few were printed. There are a few battle plans and fortification plans that end up in print, in which case they stand pretty much as propaganda for, in this case, the French or the British or the Germans, whoever was producing them. So this is one kind of mapping as a social instrument. There, as we'll see as we go through the rest of this talk, there are plenty of other ways in which maps serve as instruments of knowledge, instruments of activity. Another
context, and the second important context for maps, is that they are also cultural documents. Here we have a completely different kind of map. It's a map of the world, It's done by a man named Charles Price. It was published in London in 1714. It shows the world in two hemispheres using this tilted or oblique projection for the world. But in addition, it's not only a map of the world, it's also an advertisement for a shop. And if you look at the bottom of the map, you can see a great variety of things that are sold at George Wilde's store near St. Paul's Cathedral. Everything from spectacles and teacups and combs to firearms, to checkerboards, to globes, to lanterns. So the map serves several purposes, and it's the kind of printed map that was not particularly expensive. It was commonly available to any customer who saw it in the shop, and it was often advertised in the emerging daily press of the times. So you begin to see that maps not only serve as where things are, but also a form of consumption for the public. So this tells us that there are different kinds of maps for different purposes. Matthew, something about then a geographical map, like the Price World Map.
Right, so this is geographical map. Geographical in the sense that these are maps made by geographers. Some geographers geographical maps remain in manuscript, especially when they're being used for logistical purposes by the military. But in terms of geographical mapping as a whole, we're looking at mapping that's about knowledge, mapping that's about understanding the nature of the world. And so here's Jean-Nicolas Delisle's large map of Russia, published in 1745 as part of an atlas. Again, a collection, a systematic collection of maps that were intended to be sold as a set and consumed as a set, to give you an overview map like this, but also then more detailed regional maps of all the different provinces.
So a geographical map is a map that I like to think of at a kind of zoomed out scale. It's when if you're looking at an area, and if you zoom out from it, you get the larger context. By contrast, the kind of map that Louis XIV was looking at as he was planning his attacks on fortified places in Holland was a map that was zoomed in. It was where a small space is shown in very large detail. And that kind of map is a military map. And you can see it's very, very different from the geographical map Matthew just talked about. It's in manuscript, it's hand colored. As Matthew had mentioned before, military maps were made for not large circulation, like a printed map, which could be printed in the hundreds or thousands, but it was circulated in very small numbers, probably no more than 50 at the most, I would say. So Matthew, this was the quandary you and I and David Woodward faced 20 years ago, which is there are a lot of different kinds of maps. We'll be talking about more of them shortly. How do we give comprehensive and a kind of equitable treatment to all the kinds of maps made in all the kinds of spatial situations of Europe in the 18th century? Where did we begin?
Well, first thing we did was to look at what had been done. And so the first volumes of the history were written in a very traditional way as large monographs with big chapters by people, sometimes small chapters, sometimes very big chapters. And the chapters were written by acknowledged experts who wrote about what they knew. And so the early volumes very much emphasize the kinds of maps, the kinds of histories that have already been told. Now, against that is the fact that Harley and Woodward urged their authors to think about maps as social documents, social instruments, as cultural documents. And that led a lot of the authors to write and to investigate maps in new ways and write about them in new ways. So one of the reasons the volumes grew much bigger than the initial plan. The initial plan, by the way, was for 4 volumes totaling 1 million words. When volume 1 came out, already covering just about half of what was intended in that volume, it came out at 425,000 words, so already much bigger than the 250,000 words that had been allotted to it, because people were looking at maps in these new ways, and they were coming up with really interesting stuff. But it's still structured by the knowledge and the experience of the individual authors. And when it came time to volume 3, you'll see on the screen, for various reasons, David and Brian began constructing the series as a series of regional essays. And that's how David did volume 3, which he began working on after Brian had died in 91. And so as he got closer to completion, David had 1 million words. He renegotiated with the press to increase the volumes to 1 million words each. And then he realized that he needed to have some interpretation. And so he solicited another 300,000 words of interpretive essays on surveying, on printing, on maps and art, maps and literature, maps and science, and so on. And unfortunately became ill and never actually got around to cutting out the 300,000 words from the spatial essays. And so volume 3 went to press at 1.3 million words.
Way too long.
Way too long. Black and white imagery, just big, and I mean, amazing stuff. But if we were to look at volume and mapping in the long 18th century in the same degree of detail, we would blow that 1.3 million words right out of the whatever.
And in addition, there was the problem of balance. And to the right of this slide, you can see, I'll just zoom in a little bit here, that if you look at how the British Isles was covered, it received 6 different essays that look at map making in the British Isles in the Renaissance. But when you got to Scandinavia, there was only 1 essay, when in fact there must, and we know that there was more map making activity that could have been covered by more than 1 essay. So a problem really stood out to us that not only, and it was a conflicting problem, because not only did we want to keep volume 4 a manageable size, it could not exceed 1 million words, but it also needed to have a kind of balance so that Scandinavia and Poland and Portugal could have the same kind of coverage for its map-making activities as France or the British Isles or the German states. So this was a problem.
I'd also say, Mary, sorry, that we were also looking forward to the later volumes, volumes 4, 5 in the 19th and volume 6 in the 20th century, where the regional contexts become less and less important. And so we needed a way to constrain everything within 1 million words. It seems small, but it could have been 4 million very easily.
It could.
Could have been 10 million. And we needed to be equitable, both in terms of giving treatment to allowing treatment of all the regional contexts, but also all the different kinds of mapping going on in all the different regional places, if they were going on. No marine charting in Austria at this point. It would be in the 19th century. So we didn't have to think about that. So the solution that David began thinking about to limiting these volumes in size and to be equitable was to structure them as an encyclopedia. Each 4, 5, and 6 will become an encyclopedia.
Now the encyclopedia suited us just fine because there is no more Enlightenment form from the 18th century than an encyclopedia, because it's a period that's really the birth of the encyclopedia in its modern form. Encyclopedias go back to antiquity. But in terms of really thinking about the structure of an encyclopedia, the 18th century was where it was at. And so in turning to the Enlightenment itself, we tried to think about, well, how did people then think about how to organize and produce knowledge in new ways? And they developed it very much in the metaphor of a tree. So Matthew, maybe you could take us a little bit through how an encyclopedia is like a tree.
It is not an obvious thing. The tree of knowledge and the encyclopedia literally means a circuit or a circle or revolution of knowledge. They don't necessarily seem to be related, but when you look at one of these kind of diagrams, and this is a great late 18th century diagram of all the different branches of mathematics, and off to the right, we've got a detail with highlighting some of the big branches, and then there's the trunks and the branches and the twigs and the leaves all the way out. And in effect, what we've done is to think about mapping in the same kind of way. We've come up with a variety of what are the big branches, what are the big trees. The trunks and the branches become interpretive entries, interpretive essays. So we're going to have an essay, a big essay on navigation. What were the processes of navigation in the 18th century? How did they use maps? How did they not use maps? Another big interpretive essay on geography and geographical mapping. But then as you go off toward the edges, you start to see far more precise kinds of entries. So at the very top, we've got terrestrial globe, about to disappear at the bottom, celestial, or armillary sphere at the top. These are particular kinds of spherical instruments, and each of them deserves their own precise entry. And so you can imagine.
So an encyclopedia also gave us not only the beginning of a structure, but it also allowed us to control size, because every entry, every article could be constricted to just the topic that it needed to cover and be given word limits as to what it could cover, but not be given, and we're also given limits for references, for bibliography that could go with that entry. So we could control.
And also the number of illustrations.
And the number of illustrations. So in every respect, the encyclopedias seem to be our answer. All we had to do now was design it. And that was our next challenge. And this doesn't look like a tree anymore, but it does will give you some familiar ideas that we've talked about already, which is the idea of a context, that maps are not just a human endeavor, but they're made for purposes and they're made within a context. And we've already talked a little bit about political context, the maps as social instruments and the maps as cultural documents. You can see on the right here our Charles Price world map, which is connected in the public sphere with the map trade and map collecting. Down at the bottom, we see Louis XIV looking at his manuscript map, connected with state formation and cartography and military cartography. In the middle, methodological contexts deal with the how of map making. How were maps printed? How were maps done in manuscript? How was that? What tools were required? What training was required? What was the science behind map making? What kind of knowledge questions needed to be answered in order to make maps of any kind? And finally, Matthew, maybe you could take us through the representational context, because this is the one that really gets to the nitty-gritty of what kind of maps were there.
and the nature of the volume as a whole. Yeah. So
Yes.
representational contexts are basically what I've been calling cartographic or mapping modes for a very long time. Modes, a way of doing something. And when you start looking at these differences, I mean, we had this difference between the manuscript map of place for a military purpose, the printed map of Russia. When you start doing those kind of comparisons for a lot of different maps, you start to see that based in terms of the kind of space that's being represented, the people for whom it's being represented, the expectations for that representation are all sort of, they form patterns, they form relatively discrete, frequently overlapping, but by and large discrete kinds of mapping modes of cartography. And there's one set of modes that are all about surveying and observation, about going out into the landscape, observing it and measuring it. So property boundary, and by boundary surveying, we're talking about the boundaries between political entities, not property boundaries, but the boundaries between Massachusetts and New Hampshire, for example, France and Italy, whatever it may be. Mapping of place, topographical mapping, urban mapping, mapping of places that are special because they're cities. And against that, there are kinds of mapping that are all about understanding the world. They're about conceptualizing, visualizing the world. So we've seen geographical mapping. There's also celestial mapping. What's the nature of the heavens and how the heavens and the earth relate? We have in the 18th century the origins of thematic mapping, the mapping of distributions of people, of religions, and so forth, minerals and geology. And then finally, there's also marine mapping, marine charting, which varies from the harbor charts all the way up to big oceanic charts. But it's part of this process of conceptualizing the world and visualizing the world. And so it seemed to us that each of these becomes a way to, each of these contexts and within each of these sub-contexts, as it were, we have what in the technical jargon of encyclopedic design are called hierarchically integrated conceptual clusters. Get it right. So we can create a hierarchy of entry terms that will then shape what will actually go into the encyclopedia from a high level. So the initial plans didn't actually work out this way. Called for an entry on surveying and observation in the Enlightenment. Turned out to be way too broad. It just didn't quite work. But then we definitely have property mapping in the Enlightenment. And then we have property mapping in all sorts of different regional contexts. And then we have more precise aspects of property mapping about particular kinds of maps, estate maps, or particular kinds of instruments used by property mappers, and so on. And you can do this for all of these different contexts, and they become giant clusters. But the really important thing, and this is where the encyclopedia is so powerful, is that in a way we're constructing one system, but by one organization, but because we have all the cross references and we have an index at the back of the book, you don't normally find an index in the encyclopedia, you can also trace, as you read, these connectivities between different contexts. And so what we're going to do for the rest of this conversation is to go through 3 or 4 of these connectivities.
The one that we've marked here, because we've talked about it a little bit, is the Charles Price World Map. Being part of the map trade as a printed map, it relies on the methodology of printing and layout and design. And it's a kind of geographical mapping because it's visualizing the world as a place. So we're going to go back to that kind of keep in this zone of map trade and map collecting and geographical maps as we look at a few of these instances of connection that an encyclopedia can offer. The map trade was extremely important in the long 18th century because it was a time, for all the wars you may know about in the 18th century, it actually was a time of general prosperity. Life was getting better for people. There was a growth in trade, economies were growing, and with that, the demand for maps were growing. And so because there's an increase in trade, there's an increase in map shops, like this one of Peter Schenk in Leipzig, a shop where you saw maps on display. You could go into the store and buy and choose the maps you wanted. You could have them colored, you could have them uncolored, you could have them made up into an atlas. You could have Mr. Schenk make the atlas for you, or you could bind it on your own. And this kind of map trade led, as Matthew has mentioned before, to map collecting. So Matthew, what do we have here?
So this is a Dutch shipping merchant's office. It's just a generic view that Margaret found, Margaret Pritchard, and you'll see above the door 2 globes. Globes always came in pairs in the 18th century, terrestrial and celestial. Terrestrials on the left, celestials on the right. There's a couple of big books, maybe atlases. And then down on the wall beside the door, we have a world map, and then a map of a particular region put up for some kind of reference. And putting maps on walls was actually quite a common phenomenon within economic places and in public places, a way for people to think about space and refer to space as necessary.
But all of this,
sorry.
I just love the fact that there are bags of money down in the bottom corner. Yeah. That the trade and collecting were also about the economy.
But they're also about literacy and education. So there are a number of paintings. If you go to the next slide, Mary, there's a number of these paintings of children, girls, women who are in various combinations, who are learning about the world as genteel children should, maybe engaging in some kind of mapping practice as well.
I think I should add here too that women were particularly encouraged to study geography and to study mathematics and astronomy, because these were considered appropriate subjects for young women of a certain class to study, because they weren't included in most men's schools curricula at this time. So it was interesting that this was a field where we see in a lot of paintings women engaging in it, and indeed women writing about it too. Now, all these maps that we've seen so far are what we've now learned to call geographical maps. These are the maps that were sold in the map shops. They were bought by merchants for their offices, hung on walls, an office at home, used by school children. They're maps at that zoom out scale of regions, countries, continents of the world. They're usually printed. They're intended for wide distribution. They are the cornerstone of the map trade. And we're now going to begin thinking about how these kinds of maps were made. So we're using as an example this map from 1743 of Italy by a French geographer called Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville, a very eminent geographer in the 18th century. His map of the whole of Italy, which was surprising when it was published because it really reoriented Italy in a way that Matthew will be describing for us in a little more detail. So what is it about d'Anville's map of Italy that makes it a good subject for us for geographical mapping?
D'Anville was one of a small number of geographers who were supported by the French state, who engaged in, another one, Robert Didier de Vaugony, called positive geography or critical geography. Rather than doing what most geographers did, which is basically copy from other people, maybe add a few bits of new information. D'Anville went back to the sources, and one of the things he did, and this is again a period when latitude observations are very common, very easy. Longitude is still problematic, even in the 1740s. It's not going to become a huge number of longitude observations until much later in the century. So what D'Anville did is to think about the roads running through Italy. And on this detail, you can actually see somebody else, not D'Anville, some later user has marked on some approximate roads between key cities. Florence are there at the right. And so what D'Anville did is essentially a geometrical restructuring of Italy. We go to the next slide, please, Mary. Mm-hmm. And so he essentially took all the roads and the information he had about the length of roads, some of which came from Roman itineraries, some of which were more recent. So there's a whole analysis he gets into about how long has a Roman stayed, the linear measurement of a Roman Empire, how does it compare to Italian miles, and so on. And then he constructs from that, centered on Rome, and on the right there you can see a meridian line going right through Rome. So he's making Rome 0 degrees. But this is just like a temporary marker, not a global thing, but a temporary thing for calculations. And from that, he recalculated all the positions of all the cities in Italy based on distances and directions. And then he replotted them all out, and results on the left, with the detail to the right. And you can see the dark shaded line is his new outline of Italy, as opposed to the thinner lines, which represent those of Delisle and I forget who the previous.
Sanson is the previous one. Yeah.
Thank you. And the other thing about D'Anville that makes his work really, really interesting is that he wrote about it at length. There's a whole thing that happens in the 18th century where geographers and other map makers start to create memoirs or memorials about the processes they went through to make a map. And so in this case, the 1745 book, Geographical Analysis of Italy, goes into this whole process and has several more sort of structural maps, goes into great length about this whole process of literally recreating Italy. D'Anville was pretty much obsessive on this point. Other cartographers, other geographers just sort of would then copy him extensively. But
it's
this is the core.
Important to note that, yes, and what he was doing here was really part of what we now think of as the scientific method. He was hypothesizing what Italy should look like, and here are the reasons, and he works out in the laboratory of his geographer's office how he's logically thinking through his analysis of his various sources. He publishes them, which offers a kind of transparency that means that other people, other geographers, or people, readers like you, me, or those children we saw in their home, could check his work, they could verify his work, they could criticize his work, they could replicate his work. So this kind of transparency of geographical map making becomes a real feature of mapping in the 18th century. That's one kind of methodology, how the map maker made his map. The other kind is how the map was actually printed. And this was also not a quick affair. It was an expensive business because all maps were printed on copper plate. They had to be, and copper plate was itself an expensive investment. We see on the left an image from Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopedia which has a series of plates about the arts and crafts of the period. This is an engraver's workshop that takes you through all the steps of engraving a copper plate, from its preparation here to its being heated here. That's it's being blackened so that when an engraver is actually engraving on the plate, there's no reflection from sunlight or daylight to get in your eyes. It's being in, and you'll notice the variety of people in this engraver's workshop that are older and younger and are male and female. The plate is being engraved and copied from a larger plan. It's traced onto a paper. Deeper lines are engraved with a burin. It's prepared for etching by acid being poured on the plate in two kinds of ways. And it will be taken from this workshop to another workshop, which we have on the right, which is where the copper plate will be printed on paper. Well, paper will be laid on the copper plate, and it goes through a tremendous rolling press that exerts great pressure on the paper and on the plate, which has been inked. And because the paper has been dampened, all the printed pages are hung up to dry here before they're sold or collected by the map seller. So this process, which I've just quickly summarized here, was expensive. It was labor intensive. It had a lot of division of labor in its parts, but the result was that many hundreds, if not 1,000 copies of a map could be printed, widely disseminated, made available. And the kind of maps that come out of this is the sort of maps that many of us think of when we think of old maps from this period. We think of those printed maps because they're the ones that have survived in many collections. So we return now, Matthew, to our concepts chart, and we see, okay, we've seen how a geographical works and gets made and gets printed. Let's turn to Louis XIV again and his military map.
And military mapping, which has connections up to the surveying processes and drafting processes of creating the maps. There's an element of science in here. The 18th century is when militaries started moving armies over large distances that were no longer tied to individual fortresses. And as such, generals needed to know more terrain, but in order to have a map that covers lots of terrain, you got to have a structure for it, which gives you the science, and it's really about place, mapping of place. So again, the imagery we've seen earlier by Collot from the end of the 18th century, which really gets into the things that a general is going to need to know about moving troops around an area. You've got the town where there's fortifications to the right. You've got hills in the middle. And on top of the hills, you have these yellow boxes, which are the lines of cavalry or infantry that are encamped near the big fortress. And then down below, you have the valley with all of the complex land uses and obstacles, not very good for moving troops through. And all these different kinds of land uses and so on. I should just say that these nice little checkerboard of pink and green fields don't actually mean, they're not actually precise boundaries of fields. They're just an indication of this is arable land, as opposed to the rough pasture at the far right of that hill and the far left.
And what really stands out on a map like this is this depiction of elevation. And as Matthew pointed out, the troops are lined up in yellow on high ground. And it was important in this period as warfare shifted more to open terrain and open area, that the relative command of high ground becomes extremely important. And even though the heights aren't shown in detail, you get some sense from this kind of shading and another kind of shading that we'll see in the next slide of hatchering. When hills are steeper than other hills. Like you can see on the left-hand side here that we have a very steep outcropping in this area to the left. So the interest in how do you render what the landscape looks like becomes a focus of something called topographical surveying. And this reaches a real intensity in the 18th century, I think it's fair to say, as we see in this map done by military engineers in the Pyrenees, in an area of the Pyrenees called Les Aldudes. And the full map is here on the right. And the detail that we're showing here is this area right in here. And if I zoom in a bit, we'll see exactly what is meant by the shading and hatchering. Hatchering is when you draw in manuscript parallel lines very, very close together to show, and the distance between the lines shows you how steep a hill is. Where they get a little farther apart, the hill is getting less steep. Where they're very close together, and then they can be shaded by another color, it's very steep indeed. So you can see as we go up through this valley, the terrain gets more and more difficult in terms of its steepness.
I should just say that all of this shading is very impressionistic. This is not based on careful measurements of height differences, or if it is, it's only through a very relative local area. There's a very clear relationship in military training between the drawing of a landscape view to take back to a general to give them an idea of the prospect of land and how they're going to move troops through. Between that kind of perspective view and a more planimetric view of these kinds of maps. But you find this kind of mapping being done all the way across Europe. You would look at this and you look at what the Austrians are doing in Eastern Europe at the same time, and they're almost identical. I mean, there's this commonality of training and expertise and personnel, in fact, moving around between different kingdoms, basically working for the highest bidder, but sharing knowledge and making a transnational kind of mapping.
And that transnationality became very important to military commanders because maps started to be codified, color schemes, the use of hatchering, the kind of symbols that were used, because the most important thing in a military map was that it could be read quickly, because decisions had to be made quickly. And all the focus, of course, was on victory. But the forms of topographical surveying we're going to see them emerge again in other kinds of mapping, not just military mapping. But one final aspect of this topographical surveying and military mapping is the methodology, is how it was done. And it was a period of invention. And one of the delightful inventions of the late 18th century, as many of you I'm sure know, was the hot air balloon, and how that allowed observation to be made from an elevated point. Prior to this period, you couldn't get much higher than a church tower. And so the idea of mapping in plan, or mapping of those mountains that we saw on the previous slide, really became an imaginary, a use of your imagination into your final depiction. But with the hot air balloon, you had a different situation. And this particular drawing is of a hot air balloon that's using a new kind of sextant for measuring angles that could be used. There's one problem with a hot air balloon is that it doesn't stay still, it moves along. And you can see in the drawing that here's the outline of the bucket of the balloon on its way up, and the kind of angles it was able to take with its new sextant. And then when it's up here, and of course it's going to be moving along in the air. And so it wasn't the ideal, before photography, it really wasn't the ideal way of doing surveying.
And you don't actually get any aerial surveying until in practice. This is all very hypothetical. We don't get it in practice for 6, 7, 8 more decades yet.
But it does demonstrate that military engineers were also on the cutting edge of thinking of new ways of doing things. And the continuing use of topographical surveying to also show different kinds of land uses as well as land forms is going to take us into the way that these kind of manuscript maps had a civic and private use. Here in this map of the area just south of Berlin in Germany, uses color, as we've seen. It uses hatchers for elevation. So it demonstrates land use and the lie of the land in a number of different ways. And it's going to be used for administrative use as well as military use. So we'll go back to our hierarchy of context to see where we go next from topographical survey maps.
In this take, we can start off with property mapping, which actually begins as a very private act by landowners to map their own property. So there's the art and craft of surveying property and so on. But over the course of the 18th century, property mapping gets adopted as a technique of the state as a way to help regularize and collect land taxes, money. So we have a classic estate plan. This is out of the Netherlands, in which the different fields of an estate, including outlying fields that are not part of it's not a single clump of land, it's a bunch of fields and properties. It's beautifully done. You have these hunting scenes, you've got a pastoral scene of cows and a goat, and this glorious gold cartouche. This is not a map to be used. This is a map to be displayed. And there's a whole genre of these estate plans that are intended clearly to go on the wall of the manor of the great house, to show off the landowner's land. There's another whole group of very similar kinds of maps that are much plainer, much simpler, that are really about the tools for estate management and so on.
So we move from maps that property maps that show off your ownership to property maps that really become legal documents. This map done in British America and Georgia is a map that's serving two functions. One is it's showing the plot of land and the measurements of land that has been granted to a man called William Few. And so as such, these bearings and distances that go from tree to tree, if you turn your head sideways, you can see that there it says black oak here, black oak, poplar. So the plan itself is to show ownership, but it also tells us the methodological side of how it was done, because the decoration on this map is not the fancy gold cartouche or land uses, but is actually our surveyors at work and our surveyors getting dinner. It's interesting that the hunting motif comes not only on the beautiful Dutch property map we just saw, but also on the Georgia map. So Matthew, maybe you can take us a little bit through what these surveyors are doing.
Sure. So on the right of this detail is the surveyor himself, with a simple instrument called a circumferenter or surveyor's compass, with a couple of sights which the surveyor uses to sight along straight lines. So from a black oak there to the next one, which is another black oak. And then trailing him are the chainsmen, the people using a chain. Originally back in medieval and early modern Europe, these were rods, also known as poles or perches. different lengths for different communities, different kinds of land even. But in the 18th century, they start to get standardized either 50-foot or 66-foot long chains. And the chainsman's job is basically to schlep this long, heavy chain and lay it on the ground between little chaining arrows, little sticks that's put in the ground. And so while the surveyor is measuring angles or bearings with respect to magnetic north, in this case, the chainsmen are moving the chain and measuring distances, how many chains and parts of chains or links is each segment of the property. And this is a technique that basically goes, I mean, it's the same kind of technique you get in Europe. Here's one of our favorite images from the book of some surveyors getting ready to plot a field in Bedfordshire. And you'll notice, though, that there's no actual instrument for measuring angles, no compass, no theodolite. In large part because a lot of English surveying was done just to measure areas of fields. And you can do that just by, you know, if you chain it around, you can do some calculations and it gives you your angles, it gives you your areas without having to worry about plotting out the map or calculating any angles. So, no, this is quite fun. But eventually, this kind of mapping ends up being used in all sorts of cadastral work. But rather than boring you with another cadastral map, we thought we'd show you this one, which is actually from an Ottoman property register out of, is of part of the properties of Istanbul. In red are key properties owned by various Islamic institutions, houses of religions, mosques, schools, and so on, with a wonderful little hill cartouche at the top. This kind of register, sometimes known as a daftar in South Asia, or I'm blanking on the name of it in England, but these are the core. They basically record what the identity of the property, who owns it, how much tax do they pay, how much tax is expected to be paid. And then one of the key markers of the 19th century for the Ottomans is going to be the introduction of cadastral mapping as a way to help regulate this kind of documentation.
And we should point out that this illustration comes from the article not about property mapping in the Ottoman Empire, but urban mapping in the Ottoman Empire. And urban mapping, property mapping, now takes us into the city itself, because that's a place where landforms, ownership, value, all come together in a kind of detailed representation of the city, which also has its connections, as we begin to see, with different kinds of methodologies, many of which we're now familiar with the trade, because maps of cities were printed, with administrative cartography, because city maps were used by civic institutions, and with military cartography, because city maps very often emerge out of that kind of fortification plan that was key in that period of military map making when the siege warfare was so important. So we see in this 1680 plan of Landskrona in Sweden by Erik Dahlberg, a true fortified city with its grid plan in the center, its bastions all around the outside. And this is a city plan that is definitely made for military design. It's suggesting improvements in its bastions here. We can see, if we look down in the bottom, it does a cross section of the moat, the area around Landskrona. And so it's using both plan and view to get its message across. It's, of course, in manuscript. This wasn't a printed plan. But if we go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, no. I'd frozen, I think so.
I wanted to lead in to this idea of the plan and view together in urban mapping, because that's a long established graphic tradition of showing cities in plan as well as in view, as in this printed map of Berlin. Maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, the thing about urban mapping in Germany is that there are two kinds of cities in the 18th century in Germany. They're the old imperial cities, Augsburg, Nuremberg, places that have been long established, centers of industry and trade. Nuremberg and Augsburg are where the German print trade was based, for example. But then in the 18th century, a number of the major landholders, the estate holders, the Dukes of Prussia and so on, start to really try to show off their power and their wealth, especially against the supposed chief, the Holy Roman Emperor. And they started building these large, complex, and elaborate what are called residence cities. So here is Berlin, which is the residence of the King of Prussia, a title gained only in 1720. And it shows not just the city that's organically developed, but it's effectively it's a new town centered on this fortification with the traces and so on, and surrounded by a series of more organically growing suburbs where the nobles and the merchants and so on are going to be living. And then down below, you can see the whole thing. So the plan gives you the whole structure. The view gives you a sense of identity, sense of landscape and value. Again, this is printed. It's meant not as a working document, but as a document that people would buy, maybe as part of an album of city views, maybe an individual plan to stick on your wall to say, hey, I like Berlin, give me business, please. As the case may be.
The development of the urban view, which is an old form, continues by the late 18th century to get bigger and bigger and bigger until it becomes a panorama, which becomes begins in the 18th century, goes into the 19th century as a kind of a Wunderkunst, a kind of a thing of amazement, of a way to view a city. It's not just a view on a relatively small map, but this panorama, which was 11 feet wide, really takes you in to the city itself. This is a view of London from the south at Blackfriars Bridge, going across, and from west to east. It is meant to awe you. You should be stupefied by this, and I hope you're even more so when we take you into the detail that you can see as you can feel yourself almost crossing Blackfriars Bridge to get across to the north side of the River Thames. They have St. Paul's Cathedral waiting for you there. So another form of urban mapping that develops in the period of the Enlightenment, that kind of takes the view to almost as far as it can go. These growth of new towns, as Matthew has mentioned, and the growth of cities themselves led to really new practices too, besides the urban view, and a whole form of urban mapping that comes about, which is urban planning. The growth of cities required that urban maps really reimagine the city itself. There was a real need for wider thoroughfares as there's more trade and more horses and carts coming into cities. There was a need for cleaner air and reduced congestion. There was a need for street names and numbering of buildings and streets. Street lighting comes in the 18th century, and planning for growth. And Enlightenment rulers, Matthew's already mentioned, Frederick II in Prussia, who's very interested in creating these new towns. So was a person like Tsar Peter I of Russia, who here is overseeing the creation of St. Petersburg, using a map, using an urban plan in order to create his plan. Urban planning was also used for renewing towns after natural disasters. In this case, Matthew, after what? Where is this a plan of?
So this is a map of Lisbon, the central portion, right down the big plaza of commerce, behind that the Acacia. 1755, this whole area was almost completely destroyed. November 1755 by a massive earthquake. It was quite the news. The weekly, monthly magazines are full of the earthquake and the results and the effects for months afterwards. So down in the lower right of the main map, there's a couple of areas of loss, unfortunately. A little square area is where the main castle is, which is now a very picturesque ruin, which was demolished by this earthquake. So the question then becomes, how does the city rebuild? And it rebuilt it. I mean, this is that portion of downtown Lisbon, which is so uniformly 18th century now. It's just a wonderful aesthetic portion. And in coloring this, I mean, so it's an interesting mix of colors for water, and they're also thinking about redoing the harbor, but they're also thinking about building a trace of one of these bastions going out into the harbor in red here. So a fundamental tool to try to figure out how are we going to redo Lisbon. Now, if I remember right, most of what is depicted on this particular plan wasn't actually in the end built. They went with a different plan, but it's again it's testament to the ways in which visual mapping was integral to trying to figure out, here's a big project. What the devil are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Right. What's involved? Who's going to do it?
It was one of many projects that were submitted to the Marquis de Pombal, who asked for plans to be submitted for how to rebuild Lisbon, not how to abandon it. Sometimes a city did need to be abandoned, as is in the case of Goa in India, which was a Portuguese depot, a very important trade counter, a depot in Portuguese East. And Goa was a very low-lying, marshy, malaria-infested area, and by the late 18th century needed to be moved. And so mapping is used for planning new towns. The outline of the plan for the new Goa in Pangim is very similar to plans for new towns in British and French North America, the same kind of grid pattern, the same kind of geometric shape for planning new towns. So we've seen here then how urban mapping connects with a lot of our different contexts, with civic power, with private power. And that takes us to finally the final area of connections and context for our volume 4, and that's the spaces that all these mapping techniques and processes go through. So we wanted to give you a list of the 25 spaces of map making. Matthew pointed out at the beginning of our discussion of the design of the encyclopedia that every representational context, every type of map we've been talking about is presented in the volume in the spaces where that kind of mapping was done. And that allows us to really look at different events in the history of mapping, as for example, the very important mapping of South America you see in this map here, which was affected by an important treaty, the Treaty of Madrid of 1750. This particular manuscript map shows the Portuguese territory in red as it was determined after the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, famous treaty where the Pope divides the world into east and west of Portuguese and Spanish holdings. And then the area in yellow on the left, the area of South America that would be Portuguese after the terms of the Treaty of Madrid. But similarly, in the volume, that's from the Portuguese point of view. You could also find boundary surveying and the treatment of the Treaty of Madrid if you looked under mapping in Spanish America. And you could learn another point of view if you read the article about indigenous mapping and cartography, so that we begin to see, and a fourth point of view done by religious societies like the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, who were important map makers in this period. So we've hoped that the way we've organized the encyclopedia has also brought lots of points of view about the mapping process and the way it was done in.
Just to be clear, I'm not sure you were there, Mary, but the body of the encyclopedia is actually organized by the mapping modes first,
Indeed.
and then by spatial context. So if you're interested in geographical mapping is the default kind of mapping, then you can go to geographical mapping entry and you'll find a large entry on geographical mapping in the Enlightenment, so a big overview. And then more precise entries on geographical mapping in the Austrian monarchy, geographical mapping in Denmark and Norway, geographical mapping in France, and so on. And so rather than having everything under all the French mapping under big entry called France, by putting all the kinds of mapping together, you can then read across about the kinds of mapping and hopefully see all sorts of new connections that people are doing similar things or different things in ways that the readers hadn't realized because they're so used to thinking about the French context or the German context. Whatever the primary context is by kind of mapping, then all sorts of new relationships come out.
So we have to ask ourselves the question now, did we keep to the challenge? Did we kept to the size? We kept it to 1 million words, in fact, probably a little bit under. We kept to about 1,800 pages. We've got 954 full color images. We'll be talking. Very pretty volume. We hope our slides have shown you how pretty it can be. There are 479 entries or articles organized as Matthew just explained, written by 207 contributors from 26 countries. And I think this is a point that we're both very proud of, that we were able to incorporate so many voices from different regions, and it allowed many contributors an opportunity to participate in what is truly a multinational volume of reference work. So we hope you get a chance to see the volume in real time yourself, all 17 pounds of it, or even acquire a volume for yourself so that you have a printed encyclopedia at home that you can consult if you like maps. So don't forget to look at the History of Cartography Project website for more information about the volume. We want to thank you very much for joining us today and just remind you that we hope we'll see you next Tuesday to learn more about some of this minutiae behind the map making that we've just touched on. We'll be having as our special guest Gottfried Hagen, our colleague from the Department of Middle East Studies here at the University of Michigan, and we're going to really focus on Ottoman mapping in the Ottoman Empire and the relationship between European map making and more traditional techniques used for visualizing space in the Middle East and how they converged in the 1700s to really change and affect map making in the Ottoman Empire. I think we were very pleased and happy to incorporate the Ottoman Empire in this volume on European map making. The following Tuesday, on March 23rd, we're going to go behind the scenes and look more closely at digitizing maps. One reason we were able to include as all our illustrations in full color was really thanks to the digital process. And I don't know how many of you are curious about how actually big maps get digitized, but Carl Longstreth, our colleague at the Clark Library, shown here, actually using one of the digitizing machines, is going to talk to us more about the challenges of digital imaging. And Matthew and I will talk about how digital illustrations and imaging have really helped research, what some of the challenges are, what some of the problems are of using digital images in researching maps, and how it helped make this volume as attractive and as allowed us to choose details for the volume as easily as we were able to do. So we look forward to seeing you both, you all, I hope, on the 16th or the 20th, both of you, on the 23rd. And I'll turn it back to Angela now to see if we have any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Mary and Matthew. That was spectacular. I think that we have several questions that are semi-related, because I think the title of the volume, and you talked a little bit about this tangentially, but I think people maybe need a little more clarification about the title, because we have questions about why does the Enlightenment have its own cartography, and how does British America get into the European Enlightenment? So perhaps just a word about that.
Well, originally, I mean, partly this is the title is a legacy of the original plan of 4 volumes. One catch-all for ancient, classical, medieval, all cultures, one for the Renaissance, one for the Enlightenment, one for the 19th century. Because the Enlightenment has always been seen as a very special period in mapping. It's when some of the things we've been talking about and many, many other things happen to give the impression in a lot of ways that quote, cartography became a science in the 18th century. It's actually quite an erroneous idea. And a large part of what we've been trying to do in volume 4 is to explode it. But in terms of the kinds of activity, the understanding of maps, the amount of mapping activity, the period 1650 to 1800 really does stand as a different period in map making from pre-1650 and Renaissance, and again from after 1800. For example, 1799 is when Alois Sennefelder creates lithography, which is going to completely, over the course of the 19th century, change production processes. The changes of industrialization that kick in after 1800 lead to differences in military activity and all sorts of other things, which lead to further changes. But in the 18th century, there's a coherent body of military tactics, coherent body of economic activity that together gives a early modern mapping, 18th century mapping, a coherency that is quite different from previous periods. So on the one hand, yeah, Enlightenment, we got stuck with it because it was predefined for us, but there's actually a category that makes sense.
And the introduction to the volume that Matthew and I wrote kind of sets that out quite clearly. And what we tried to do today was establish those little characteristics as threads through our talk today. The idea of a time of prosperity, a growth in trade, a change in literacy and education, the shift in warfare tactics. If we had set up the talk today a little bit differently, we could have done it just by characteristics of Enlightenment, cartography. But that came out, finding those characteristics really came out of the process of designing this as an encyclopedia, because we wouldn't have been able to remark on some of those unique features to the long 18th century without being able to compare similar things across different regions. And that's what the encyclopedia allowed us to do. So I think that probably answers that question without going on.
And by European, we mean European culture, not Europe. And in that sense, British America comes in, because British America is primarily, the mapping associated with British America is a form of European mapping. And so there is a divide up through the end of the 18th century between imperial activities in the Americas, which are settler colonies and slave colonies and so on the one hand, dispossession of indigenous peoples going on. On the other hand, in Africa and Asia, European imperialism is still largely through the mercantile companies, the East India companies of England, France, and the Netherlands in particular. So there's a pragmatic divide in how we treat the mapping by the British East India Company, for example, versus the mapping done in British America or New France, as the case may be.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question which I think you might talk more about in the third session, but someone is asking where the maps that are featured are located, and did you view them online? Did you have to travel to see them? And obviously with all the contributors you have, I suspect that the answers varied, but I'll let you talk about that.
I think that the last, what we have, contributors were asked to choose images that they thought would best illustrate the article, the essay or entry that they were writing. And they were the ones who had initial access to maps that were in archives. And we asked them to supply us with all the information that would be needed in order to contact that library, archive, or even private collection. The map of the balloon surveyor came from a private collection that was of a man who was known to the fellow who wrote the article on engineers and surveying. So that's how we found them. That's how we knew where they were. The process after that is lengthy, and we owe a great deal of thanks to our illustrations editor, Dana Freiberger in Madison, who is doggedly persistent at pursuing institutions that have these illustrations and requesting the digital image. I don't think there is any particular case where Matthew and I actually had to travel to see something, though often at an exhibit at various international conferences, I know Matthew and I both would see something and say, oh, we should have that in the volume.
Well, as it happens, there's one in the entry on mapping associated with solar eclipses. I had an informant tell me, he didn't actually write the volume, but he told me about an image, and I had to make a trip to a special collection library to go view the thing in the original volume. And it was very sad. It was one of the things about the editing process. It doesn't give you much time to get out into the archive. And that was my one trip to an archive the entire year. It was very sad. But I saw the map and I go, yeah, it has to be in the book. So,
So that's how that was done.
yeah.
Well, thank you.
As
very
a Michigan State. Sorry.
And we will look forward to sessions 2 and 3. So
Hope to see you again there.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Mary.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Matthew.